I think it's also important to say a couple of minutes, a minute or two about what case mix payment doesn't address. This is not a cost containment process. You can build a cost containment process into anything. Your current rates can have a cost containment process. State could pay 95 cents on the dollar and have a cost containment right away. There are lots of ways to do cost containment. Case mix payment is not about cost containment. It's about taking whatever the size of that pie is and dividing it more equitably. So it doesn't mean it's cost containment. You could build it in or you could not build it in. That's a decision that you guys are going to have to deal with amongst yourselves and with the state as to what is the size of that pie. And then finally, case mix is not a quality assurance system. People say, how is your case mix going to improve the quality of my facility? It won't. It won't necessarily improve the quality. What it will do is it will give more money to people who care for heavier care people who should be spending more money on caring for them. So it helps indirectly by providing the resources to provide quality, but it doesn't assure quality directly. Can I move to the next slide, please? So let's start with nursing facility. And how do you actually go about measuring case mix in nursing facilities? Well, there's a lot of science involved with this, and we've done a great deal of work on it. I've done I've done 5 studies for the U.S. government. I've done other studies in other nations and so forth. The way we approach nursing facility case mix measure is we go out and we measure the actual care that's provided in real nursing homes under real situations where they're trying to deal with everybody who's demanding help and accidents happen or whatever. All of that's happening. We measure what's actually provided. We measure particularly the variable resource use, that's associated with the type of individual. So we're measuring primarily nursing time and therapy time. When I say nursing, I mean very broadly nursing. So it's not just registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, but a lot of the time, about 2/3 of the time or even more, is done by licensed certified aides. Every state has a different name for that, but CNA would be a standard term, certified nurse assistant. So we measure those resources, and we measure not only the care that's provided in hands-on care, but all the care provided for a person. So that would include, for example, if you're on a phone talking to the person's physician about a problem that they have, or you spent a great deal of time developing a care plan, or recording things in the record, or arranging for other services to be brought in for that person. All the care that's provided to or for the person is measured. And these are complicated time and motion studies that we've done. We've done them very successfully, and we get very good measures of the cost of care over a 24-hour, 48-hour period for that person. Then we take a look at what are the characteristics of that person, and we get that from the MDS. For example, now it would be the MDS 3.0. When we did the study, it was an MDS 2.0 that we actually collected the data on. And then we develop patient groups. And let me parse this sentence apart. We develop patient groups based on patient characteristics so that patients in a group have similar costs of care. And by the way, I'm using the term patient. Sometimes you use the term resident. I'm not trying to make any implication here. It's just easier to use one particular word in a situation. So develop patient groups. There are lots of ways that you could think of developing a case mix system. It could be a numerical system where you add 2 points for this characteristic and double it for that characteristic, and take the square root or something else. I don't mean to be silly, but there are ways that you could put it together into an index type of a system. Well, we've gone the direction is with patient groups. So every person falls into one and only one group of individuals, and therefore it's easy to understand who those people are, and you can visualize it. We think it's better from a statistical point of view, from a methodological point of view, to have patient groups, and we think also that it makes more sense in terms of clinically being able to understand who's in a patient group. Those patient groups should be based upon patient characteristics, so they're not in the derivation, not based upon anything about the facility. So it doesn't matter if the person's in a not-for-profit facility or for-profit or a government-owned facility or a facility in an urban area, rural area. None of that comes into into play here. We're simply asking, what is it about the individual that explains why these individuals cost 20% more than other people in the facility? And the third statement, so that patients in a group have similar cost of care. Well, we're dividing the whole list of all possible patients into a limited number of groups. Here we're talking about in the mid-60s number of groups. So clearly there'll be considerable variability even within a group, but on the average we say that people in this group will cost 20% more, say, than people in that group. Once you have developed these patient groups, then you want to develop a relative weight. We call this a case mix index, or CMI, for each group. And so that is the point where we say not only is this person in this group, but also this group has a case mix index of 1.2. They're 20% higher than a person in a group who is an average of 1.0. Next slide, please. Once you've got all of those data, you've got the measures of time and cost, you've got the patient characteristics, then you want to try and develop the groups, and in doing that we use multiple sets of criteria. The first is statistical. We want to have a system that explains the cost of care. So we take the variable cost, we price it out with wages, and we say, okay, it costs this amount to care for each individual in our sample. We develop very large samples in developing this. We can say more about that if you'd like. And the statistical measures, for example, would say how much of the differences we see between individuals can be explained by the system. But we've found that statistically you don't necessarily get the best system by just following statistical criteria. That we found that when you also look at the problem of developing patient groups from a clinical point of view, then you will get a better system. If you start to try to analyze what explains differences between the individuals, the best single measure is a measure of activity of daily living. Almost any one of them. One ADL explains a great deal of the differences we see between individuals. If you then say, how could I refine it more? What variable about characteristic of the individual would better tell me the differences within those groups I would see? The answer is always a second ADL. Gives you a little bit more. And then a third ADL gives you a teeny little bit more. And then you find nothing else explains differences. And older case mix systems just did this. They looked at 2, 3, or 4 ADLs, and that's all they did. But we found in developing the system I'm talking about here, called resource utilization groups, or RUGs, we found that looking at it from a clinical point of view and asking the question, tell me about the type of individuals you see. Who do you try to seek out, or who do you ask about characteristics of someone you'd want to admit from a nursing home, from a hospital to your nursing home or into your home care program, that the answers to that question led us to other measures, and forcing those measures into the model by using those characteristics to define the people first and then splitting by ADLs actually led to a much better system. So our criteria is a combination of statistics and clinical. We don't want to have too many groups. You don't want to have thousands of groups, so we have a limited number of groups. But a really important fourth set of criteria around what I'll call administrative or incentives. And you want to make sure that certain characteristics don't get into your system. Let me explain, give you an example of one that could be gained in a bad way. It turns out that people who have the characteristic of having a catheter, an indwelling catheter, are more expensive to care for. Why are they more expensive to care for? Well, yes, you care for the catheter. It doesn't take a lot of time. But that's not what makes those people expensive. What makes people with catheter expensive is that they're sicker people. And they have a whole bunch of other problems, of which catheter is one of the results of those problems. So it is true that people with a catheter cost more. But now put it into a payment system. Let's say that you have a payment system that pays more for people with a catheter. Now that's picking up all the costs around a person who is sicker with a catheter and therefore provides an incentive to catheterize people. In other words, catheterize people who don't have those other characteristics for which you'll only be paying the cost of the catheter and caring for the catheter. So that provides an enormous incentive to catheterize people. It's not saying that anybody out there is going to do that, but you really don't want to have that type of incentive in the system. So there are certain characteristics that you want to avoid. You want to pick up this sense of illness that's picked up by catheter in another way that actually measures the characteristics of the individual and not the service that's been provided them. In other words, catheterization. That works for most cases, but then there's the strange case of rehabilitation services. And this, in a way, argues exactly against what I just said. Because what you'd want to do is to pick up the need for rehabilitation and not the fact that you're providing rehabilitation. But the problem is that we really don't know who should get rehabilitation or how much they should get. I have quipped, if you show one patient to 5 physicians and ask them how much rehabilitation should this person get, you'll get 6 or 7 different answers. One person will say they should get 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week. Another person will say, no, they ought to get it once a week for an hour. Another person will say, no, it ought to be daily for 15 minutes. And another person will say, I don't think they'll benefit from rehabilitation at all. So in that situation, there's not a close link between the characteristics of the individual and the provision of rehabilitation. And therefore, paying on the average across people who get rehabilitation and don't get rehabilitation or get a lot of rehabilitation and not a lot of rehabilitation would be unfair to facilities that provide rehabilitation and a windfall for facilities that don't provide rehabilitation or very little, and that won't work very well. So for rehabilitation services, we really do have to go on the basis if rehabilitation services are being provided, then essentially you're going to be reimbursed for those rehabilitation services. So there's a particular case where, in fact, you're trying to provide an incentive to provide rehabilitation service, or at least no disincentive to avoid it, where you will actually include a situation that's not actually a characteristic of the individual in the classification system, the case mix system. Can I have the next slide, please? So how do we get to where we are now? We're suggesting that the system being used in Arkansas be RUG-4, Resource Utilization Group's Roman numeral 4, 4th version of it. Medicare has been using RUG since 1998. We just finished a major national study and I was the technical analytical leader of that, and we looked in a very large data collection done between 2006 and 2007. We collected the type of data I just talked about, and the first thing we tested was to find out whether the existing RUG-3 system that we developed in the 1990s was still working, even though things may have changed in the nursing home industry. And the answer is we found that the RUG-3 system worked perfectly well. We could have done it and used it with, at most, minor modifications. So the focus of this study then turned to what sorts of changes would be important to do to make a RUG-4 system that would be a modification of the RUG-3 system. And there were 2 major changes that I probably should focus on. There were a lot of small changes in it, and I can provide a lot of detail, and there's information on CMS website, for example, for this. But the 2 major things that really affected facilities in moving to RUG-4 was, first of all, that in terms of calculating the therapy time under the old system, the RUG-3 system, if you had concurrent or group therapy that was being provided to 3 people at the same time, so say one therapist was dealing with 3 people over an hour period of time, under the old system, each of those people was considered to have received an hour of therapy time, and therefore the facility was getting credit for 3 hours of therapy time, if you will, 1 hour provided to each individual at the same time, and that's now been changed under the new rules to say that time will have to be divided up, so that each person actually considered to have gotten a 20% effective amount of therapy time. The second major change that really changes case mix for individuals is that some services that were fairly expensive, such as IV medications, that were evaluated in the first 14 days of being in a nursing home, the assessment reached back 14 days and therefore could go back into the prior hospital stay. So it led to a scientific question. If a person got IV medications in the hospital, before they were admitted into the nursing home, would they be more expensive patients, or would only be if they're on IV medications once they're admitted to the nursing facility? And we tested that and found out that in fact the answer was they only were more expensive if they're actually being provided IV medications concurrently. In other words, at the time in the nursing facility. And that did have significant impact upon the case mix of individuals under the Medicare program. So the RUG-4 program is being used all for Medicare, so all of you will know about it from that, and that's the system we're talking about here for measuring in Arkansas. Let's switch to talk about home care. In home care, the approach is really the same as in nursing facilities. Here the assessment is the uniform assessment, which is the in-try home care assessment, or the HC, and the system which we're recommending is a system that's compatible with the institutional measures. So it's compatible with the RUG-3 system, which, as I mentioned, is very, very similar to the RUG-4 system in most of the important, almost all of the important measures. By developing the same system, first of all, there's a good logic to that. Many cases, people are in a home care setting in lieu of being in a nursing home. They're diverted from going into a nursing home. And if they were in a nursing home, if some particular characteristic or system would explain their cost, the same thing should explain the cost of maintaining them at home. It may not be the same amount of cost, but the same relative measure that this person costs 20% more should be also true that they should cost more. Maybe not 20% more, but they should cost more as well in a community setting. The second issue is that if you use a consistent measure across those two settings, it really allows you to understand better who's being placed where and how to compare them. If you measure home care in a very different way than you measure nursing homes, it becomes awfully difficult to try to understand case mix across settings.